It was supposed to be routine. Just another government address, formal, structured, forgettable. President Cyril Ramaphosa was scheduled to speak about South Africa's future in the African Union. Schools had paused their morning lessons. Offices streamed the broadcast on big screens. Even traffic slowed down as the entire country tuned in. The camera went live. The president stepped into the studio, confident, composed. But something was off. On the desk in front of him, there was an envelope, white, unmarked, sealed with crimson wax. It bore no name, no return address, only the unmistakable insignia of Burkina Faso. Ramaphosa froze. He leaned in, picked up the envelope, and turned it over in his hands. The room fell silent. Even the lighting seemed to hesitate. He looked directly into the camera and spoke quietly. "This was handed to me just minutes ago. From Captain Ibrahim Traoré." A murmur swept through the studio. The control room panicked. This wasn't in the script. Journalists leaned forward. Phones buzzed. Twitter lit up. But the president didn't flinch. Slowly, he broke the seal. And something changed in his eyes. He unfolded the thick parchment with care. As he scanned the first few lines, his posture shifted. His breath hitched. The man who'd faced years of political storms was visibly shaken. For the first time in years, the people of South Africa saw something they never expected. Their president was trembling. He tried to read the letter out loud, but his voice cracked. He stopped, inhaled deeply, and started again. "To the honorable leader of South Africa, I write to you not as a president, but as a fellow son of Africa, who cannot sleep at night." Ramaphosa blinked rapidly. His grip tightened on the page. The words weren't political. They were human. They were raw. They were undeniable. "I see children starving in Lasso. I see teenagers drowning in the Mediterranean, chasing a Europe that does not want them. I see brothers in Nigeria losing faith in democracy. And I ask myself, what have we become?" The president's voice broke again. One of the journalists turned away from the camera, silently wiping tears. In homes across the country, people leaned closer to their screens. And then came the sentence that silenced a nation. "If we, the ones with power, sleep peacefully while our people suffer, then we are not leaders. We are the final betrayal." President Ramaphosa didn't finish the page. He lowered the letter. His shoulders trembled. "Live." On national television, the feed remained uninterrupted. The silence was deafening. Something had shifted. And South Africa knew. This was no longer politics. This was a reckoning. The studio was dead silent. President Ramaphosa stood frozen. One hand gripping the letter. The other clenched tightly at his side. Viewers at home weren't blinking. In schools, offices, crowded taxis, no one moved. The moment had swallowed the nation whole. And the letter had only just begun. The president tried again. His voice steadier this time. But his eyes gave him away wet. Glassy. Overwhelmed. "I possess tanks. I possess firearms," he read. "But I remain sleepless, knowing a mother in Kicha sobs because she cannot feed her child." A soft gasp escaped from someone off camera. Another journalist reached for tissues. These weren't policy points. These weren't diplomatic pleasantries. These were the confessions of a man burdened by the truth. And it came from another president. Captain Ibrahim Traoré was not asking for aid. He wasn't demanding recognition. He was pleading for conscience. I see teenagers drowning in saltwater dreams. Ramaphosa continued. And I ask, how did we let this become normal? He paused, looking around the studio, like a man waking up in a room he no longer recognized. I see brothers in Nigeria. He read, losing their belief in democracy. I see elders begging outside oil-rich compounds. I see genius dying, nameless in hospital hallways. He stopped reading again. The control room debated cutting to commercial. One producer whispered, should we go to break? But the director shook his head violently. Are you out of your mind? The world is watching. And they were. Social media exploded. TikTok clips were already being uploaded. Twitter was flooded with a single question. What is in that letter? Ramaphosa wiped his mouth and continued. His voice now was more than a voice. It was a mirror. If we, the ones with power, sleep peacefully, while our people suffer, then we are not leaders. We are the final betrayal. That line hit like a hammer. The letter slipped slightly from his grip. His shoulders hunched. For a moment, it looked like he might fall. But he didn't. He stayed. And then, with hands trembling, he reached the next paragraph. What are we building? He read aloud. If the bones of our people pave the path to our pride, then what exactly is the destination? A camera zoomed in closer than ever before. The president's face was no longer the face of a politician. It was the face of a man. He was crying. No one interrupted. No one dared. And still, the letter wasn't done. Somewhere behind the cameras, a young staffer whispered, "This isn't a speech. It's a wake-up call." She was right. Back at home, a teenage girl tweeted, "I've never seen my president cry before. Why do I feel like this letter is speaking to all of us?" The comments poured in. Is this real? Is this the moment Africa changes? Why does it feel like my soul is hearing itself for the first time? And then, Ramaphosa said something no one expected. I can't finish this alone. He stepped back. The letter trembled in his hands. Then he said, "Play the tape." The screen behind him came alive, and from the speakers, steady and deep, came the voice of the man who wrote it all, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. And as his voice filled the studio, South Africa braced for what came next. Because everyone knew this wasn't just a letter anymore. It was a storm. The screen went black, but the world didn't. Across South Africa, across the entire continent, people sat in stunned silence. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's voice still echoed in their minds. He had spoken not as a leader, but as a witness to suffering, to silence, and to the soul of Africa, gasping for air. And that gasp, it was felt everywhere. In Cape Town, a street vendor paused mid-sale. He had replayed the tape on his old Nokia so many times the battery was dead. Still, he whispered the words to himself. If we are not feeling, we are not leading. In a Johannesburg clinic, a nurse streamed the speech from her phone for patients waiting in line. One elderly man removed his cap, closed his eyes, and listened like it was prayer. In Soweto, a taxi driver pulled over mid-route. He turned to his passengers and said, "I don't know who that man is, but he just said everything I've wanted to say for 20 years. Children in classrooms stopped fidgeting. Teachers, instead of handing out math problems, pressed play on the clip. even principals, hardened by years of bureaucratic fatigue, stood in doorways, quietly weeping. And then came Ayanda, 10 years old. Limpopo, a cracked phone in her grandmother's lap. Traoré voice, though pixelated and scratchy, rang crystal clear in her heart. Why is that man crying? Gogo, she asked. Her grandmother paused, looked down at her. Because someone finally said the truth. Ayanda didn't know what the African Union was. She didn't understand sovereignty, politics, or foreign policy. But she knew what it felt like to fall asleep, hungry. She knew the sound her mother made when there was no money left for bread. So when Traoré said, "No child should sleep with pain in their belly while gold is taken from our land," she understood every word. That night, Ayanda pulled out her school notebook and drew a picture of the man on the screen. Beneath it, she wrote, "He remembers us." And she wasn't the only one. Children across the country began drawing, writing, speaking not because they were told to, but because something deep inside had been stirred awake. Hope, recognition, truth. Insoshanguve. A teenager posted a TikTok, just the audio of Traoré's speech over a black screen with the caption, "I've never cried from politics. Until now." It hit 1 million views in 3 hours. But perhaps the most powerful moment came from a mother of 3 in Kicha. In a grainy video she posted to Facebook, she held back tears as she said, "I have never seen President Ramaphosa cry. But when he read that letter, I cried with him. Because for the first time in a long while, I felt seen." It didn't matter that the letter was written to a president. It had reached the people, and the people were wide awake. It arrived without cameras, no press, no headlines, just a quiet envelope, hand-delivered. President Ramaphosa was still reeling from the moment that had shaken his country and himself only days before. He'd barely spoken publicly. His advisors kept asking, "What comes next?" But the truth was, he didn't know. Until that morning, a staffer entered his office, holding a sealed envelope with trembling hands. "Sir, it's from Zinzi Mandela." Ramaphosa sat upright. The daughter of Nelson Mandela. He opened it carefully. Inside wasn't just a letter. It was a pulse, a rhythm that carried the weight of a legacy. He unfolded the handwritten note. "Mr. President, my father once said, 'It always seems impossible until it is done.' I watched you break down on live television, and what I witnessed was not weakness. I saw Mandela within you, and I saw the heartbeat of Africa in Captain Traoré." Ramaphosa's hands began to shake. But there was more. Tucked inside was a thin sheet of paper, aged, faded, gently scanned from a private diary. One of Nelson Mandela's final entries. Never published. The margins were filled with thoughts, reflections, fragments of a man staring down history's edge. And near the bottom, circled in ink, were words that made Ramaphosa gasp. "One day, a young lion shall rise in the West. He will not speak for power, but for the voiceless. He will not wear a crown, but he will carry a continent, and the world must listen to him." Silence consumed the room. Ramaphosa stood by the window, still holding the page. Outside, birds flew past Union buildings as if carrying invisible banners. He whispered to himself, "Is it him? Is Traoré the lion?" The air felt charged, like thunder waiting for permission. And just then, another knock. This time, not a letter. A woman. Young. Confident. Poised. She stood at the gate with no appointment. No entourage. Just a folder in hand. Security scrambled. Advisors panicked. But Ramaphosa descended the stairs himself. She bowed respectfully. My name is Fatou Traoré. I am not a politician. I am a farmer's daughter. But my brother found his voice. She handed him the folder. Inside were dozens of handwritten notes, dust-stained. Folded with care. Messages from children. Farmers. Elders, each bearing their hopes in ink and sweat. One simply read, "Tell South Africa we believe in them." Ramaphosa looked at her. "Why now?" he asked. Her voice was steady, fierce, soft like thunder. Because history doesn't knock twice. And Africa is knocking now. Friday, 8:00 p.m. West African time. Entire families sat huddled around televisions. Radios. Cracked phones balanced on makeshift stands. From Lagos to Lusaka. From Dakar to Durban. The continent wasn't just watching it, was waiting. For a man they had never seen quite like this. The screen faded in. No military uniform. No grand banners. Just a plain African shirt. Sleeves rolled casually to his elbows. Ibrahim Traoré stood center frame. The quiet hum of the studio barely audible. He looked directly into the camera and spoke. To every mother who has ever gone to sleep with an empty stomach. To every father who left his village in search of work that was never there. To every child who believes they must leave Africa to be valued. He paused. You were never forgotten. You were silenced, and I have come to end that silence. The air left the room. In kitchens, in buses, in crowded public squares, people froze. His voice was steady, but his eyes carried the storm. It continued. What if the true poverty is not in our wallets, but in our unity? The question lingered like thunder. Then, he leaned in. I want to share something I've never spoken of publicly. When I was 14, I watched my neighbor collapse in the street. His daughter screamed for help. But there was no doctor, no clinic, only dust and silence. He died in her arms. Traoré closed his eyes for a moment. That man wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a politician. He was simply African. And yet, no media came. No cameras. No outrage. Why? Because African pain doesn't go viral. Gasps filled homes. Tears fell silently. It continued. I made a promise that day. If I ever stood before the world, I wouldn't speak of my achievements. I would speak of his death, because until his story matters, none of us do. Then, he lifted the letter. This was never just a letter. He said, it is a mirror. And tonight, I ask every African to look into it. A pause. And then he reached beneath the desk and pulled out a thick, bound document. Stamped in gold. This is my proposal. He said clearly. A Pan-African coalition. Built by us. For us, no foreign aid. No puppeteers. No intermediaries. 10 nations to start. Shared education. Shared defense. Shared resources. We don't wait for help anymore. We build. The studio was still, but the streets outside weren't. In Lusaka, a bus conductor stood on his seat and shouted, We are witnessing history in Kinshasa. Market vendors pulled out radios and turned up the volume. Across WhatsApp groups and live stream chats, one phrase repeated like a heartbeat: "He's doing it." Back in the studio, Traoré spoke one final time. "I will not live forever, but if we build this together, Africa will." And with that, he bowed his head in silence. No applause, no anthem, just hope. Raw and unfiltered. The screen went black. And the continent, it stood. Not for ceremony, but for something far deeper. A new beginning. The broadcast ended. But Africa didn't go back to sleep. That night, across the continent, something stirred. Not anger, not chaos, but something deeper. A vibration. A heartbeat. By morning, the wave had begun. In Cape Town, a classroom with no roof and dirt floors gathered early. Students carried notebooks pressed to their chests. At the center of the blackboard, written in white chalk, were 7 simple words: "Let us build a great Africa." Captain Ibrahim, Traoré, the teacher, Miss Alina, and stood beside it, tears in her eyes. She whispered to a journalist over a borrowed phone, "We have waited so long for someone to speak to us. Not about charity, but about dignity." Her students had drawn maps of Africa, but this time, there were no borders. Just one phrase, one people, one dream. In Uganda, a university renamed its debate hall the Traoré Room. Students gathered around open-air tables, reading excerpts of the letter as if it were scripture. In Accra, artists filled alleyways with murals, children holding hands across flags, mouths open in song. In Ghana, market women chanted as they worked, "No more crumbs from the world. We bake our own bread now." It spread like wildfire. In Soshanguve, a teenager played the speech on a Bluetooth speaker in the center of a football field. By the time the recording ended, every player had removed their cleats and stood in silence. In Bujumbura, a bus driver painted 3 words across his windshield: "Africa first. Always." And in a small village outside Bamako, a child stood on a wooden crate in a dusty street. Her name was Ayanda, 10 years old, the same Ayanda who once whispered, "Why is that man crying?" This time, she wasn't asking. She was reading, clutching the printed letter in both hands. She read aloud to a crowd of grown men and women gathered around her. Her voice cracked, but she never stopped. "If we, the ones with power, sleep peacefully while our people suffer, then we are not leaders. We are the final betrayal." And the people cried, not just from sorrow, but from recognition. This wasn't politics anymore. This was memory. This was identity. This was a reawakening. In Kampala, an elderly man stood at a roundabout and passed out printed pages of the letter to anyone who stopped. "They silenced our tongues for years," he said, "but they never silenced our hearts." The movement had no official name, no branding, no leaders, no sponsorships, but it had a soul. It echoed in schoolyards and market stalls, in taxis and temples, in songs and in silence, and in the quiet of a presidential office in Pretoria. Cyril Ramaphosa watched the footage unfold street by street, heart by heart. He turned to his advisor and whispered, "This is no longer just a message. This is the moment." 21 days later, President Cyril Ramaphosa stepped once more into the same studio, same lights, same cameras, same desk. But this time, he was no longer trembling. The producer leaned in and whispered, "Mr. President, we're livin', TTT." Ramaphosa looked directly into the lens. His voice was calm, measured, but every syllable carried weight. 3 weeks ago, I opened a letter that broke something inside me. Not because it was cruel, but because it was true. He paused. Captain Ibrahim, Traoré, did not attack me. He reminded me of the promises we buried beneath politics and paperwork. The screen behind him lit up. Bold words appeared. Africa rising an invitation to build. Ramaphosa continued today. South Africa accepts that invitation. We will not just participate. We will co-lead. And we will not send just diplomats. We will send teachers, engineers, doctors, people who carry Africa in their hearts and in their bones. Across the continent, people erupted. In Johannesburg, strangers hugged in the streets. In Ouagadougou, families wept openly. Tears of pride, tears of hope. But this was only the seed. 3 days later, something extraordinary happened. In Kigali, then Lagos, then Addis Ababa, then Gabon, thousands marched, not in protest, but in purpose. Elders in dashikis, women carrying infants, teenagers waving Pan-African flags. They chanted the words scrawled across walls and phone screens. The letter woke us up. Africa first. Africa forever. We are one people. In Cape Town, someone lifted a photo of Ramaphosa crying. In Bamako, a massive banner unfurled across a government building. Traoré's words blazing in bold. If unity is our burden, then division is our curse. And in Soweto, little Ayanda stood once more this time, on a stage built from crates and cloth. She clutched the letter in her hand and read it aloud again. But her voice had changed. It carried now, like the wind, and the people. They listened. Weeks later, in Ouagadougou, a statue was unveiled. It wasn't a general, not a president, not a warrior. It was an envelope, torn open, and from it, words lifted like birds in flight. At its base, a simple inscription, one letter, one continent, one dream. In schools, children studied the letter in literature classes. In towns, they painted murals of children holding hands across flags. In churches and mosques, they recited its lines like sacred verse, but somewhere quiet off camera. Far from microphones, something even more powerful took place. President Ramaphosa traveled to Burkina Faso. No press, no security convoy, just a walk in a quiet garden. Beside him stood Captain Ibrahim. Traoré. No titles, no speeches, just two men. They walked together beneath a setting sun. Ramaphosa turned and said softly, "You didn't just write a letter. You rewrote history." Traoré smiled. "No, we all did." And as dusk settled over the garden, the voices of children singing the new Pan-African anthem rose gently into the air. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. But it was real. Africa had remembered itself. And now, the world would have to listen.